Hi, my name is Kruti. I am a front-end consultant and Nuxt ambassador, and today we are going to learn about page transitions in Nuxt. You can find me on GitHub, Twitter, CodePen, and Medium, and you can also check out the concept diagrams about Nuxt on my personal website. Alright, so what is Nuxt? Nuxt is a framework that is built on top of Vue.js, and it follows best practices of Vue.js and Node.js, and that is what makes it more performant and very easy to use. Now with Nuxt, we can use the same code base to build server rendered websites, we can generate static sites, and even build single page apps. And at the heart of Nuxt, we have a file-based routing system. That means any Vue files we create under pages directory here, they become web pages. And on these pages, we can fetch data, validate dynamic parameters, apply transition, and even dispatch store actions. So of all these and many other features, today we will focus on page transitions. Let's see, why do we need page transitions? Page transitions can simply be fun and pleasing to look at, and they can help us increase user engagement. They also provide better user experience by making sure that the user experience isn't interrupted when we add, remove, or update data on the screen. And it helps us prevent that split-second white flash that we sometimes see in between page navigation. That is especially true for async data feature of Nuxt, because the data is fetched on server side first and then it is served on the client side, and in between that there is a moment where we see no content on the page. So in that situation, the page transitions can really help. Page transitions can also act as a visual cue and provides a continuation when something has changed on a screen. Before we begin with the page transitions in Nuxt, it's important that we know how Vue's transition component works. So let's take a look at Vue's transition component and how it works. So transitions are created by updating the value of CSS attributes when our element or Vue component enter or exit the screen. And Vue's transition component allows us to capture these moments before, during, and after the element is inserted or removed. And we have three classes to capture the entering transition, and we have three classes to capture the leaving transitions. And all of these classes are namespaced. That means, for example, if we were to write fade transition, the V hyphen that you see on slide will be replaced with the namespaced CSS transition class called fade, and it would look something like that. So we can see that Vue's transition component is a tiny little transition system on its own, and it is very versatile, and we can use it 4 different ways. So let's see how. When we use CSS transition, we can move our element from point A to point B, and then it uses a transition attribute to define that active state. For example, here we are simply animating the opacity of an element. Second way we can use Vue's transition component is with CSS animation. CSS animations are slightly different than CSS transition, because here we can move our element from point A to point B to point C using keyframes, and then they use animation attributes to capture those keyframes. So for example, here we are animating the scale attribute of our element, and it looks like this. The third option we have is to combine Vue's transition system with external CSS animation library, for example animate.style, and we can access animate.style classes directly in our transition component, like we have in this example. Slide in left and slide out right, they belong to the animation.style library. Our fourth and the final option is to define JavaScript hooks in attributes. This is where we move away from the CSS transition and we let JavaScript takes care of our animation, and this is a really good option when we want to use external JavaScript animation libraries, for example GreenSock, and this is where we can realize the full potential of Vue's transition system. Let's see how it all fit together in the world of Nuxt. The Nuxt configuration file is the blueprint of your Nuxt project, and here you will find details about plugins, modules, environment variables, default meta tags, and so on. And by default, Nuxt covers most use cases with the sensible defaults, but we can always override them if needed. So you may ask, what is the significance of Nuxt config file when it comes to page transitions? Well, page transitions can be global and can be applied to all the pages in your Nuxt app, and when that happens, we can define our page transitions in Nuxt configuration file here. And on the other hand, page transitions can be applied to individual pages as well, and when that is the case, we can define page transitions on single page components here. And by default, page transitions are route based, so we can see them come alive when we navigate the Nuxt site using Nuxt link there. So to understand all this, let's create one global page transition that can be applied to all the pages of your Nuxt app. As you can see, it's a two-step process. The first step is to define your transition. Here we have defined the fade transition that we saw earlier, and the step 2 would be to make sure that this transition is available globally for all the pages, and that's why we would include the CSS file in our Nuxt configuration. Now this won't really work because by default Nuxt looks for a transition name called page, and that's why our fade transition won't have any effect on Nuxt pages. So how do we fix it? We can simply replace our fade namespace with page, like that. And after this, if we access any internal page with Nuxt link, we can see our fade transition in action. But what if we really want to call our transition fade? Can we override the default transition with our own name? The answer is yes. We can use page transition property to override the default transition name. So what really happens to Vue's transition component in Nuxt? Well, back in Vue, we write our transition component in the template area, but in Nuxt, we write the same component in our script section using the page transition key. And second big difference we have here is that we don't have to write the if condition when we write transitions in Nuxt, and we don't have to handle the conditional rendering in Nuxt as we do in Vue. So let's see how many types of transitions we have in Nuxt, because this was just the page transition. Are there any others? Well, let's see. The first option we have is the page transition, which we just saw how it works, and it is global in nature and it has a default value of page. The second option we have is transition for individual pages, and we can define that using just the transition key. The third option we have is the layout transitions. Now, layout transitions are global in nature, and they also have the default value of layout. So make sure you have a layout transition defined in your global CSS, and you will be able to see the layout transition in action when you change layouts. Now, the strings you see here, like fade, slide up, and bounce, they are all CSS transition classes. By default, Nuxt will look for these class names in global CSS, but how many other types of values we can use for our Nuxt transition? So let's see transition values. By default, the transition value is set to string, which is a CSS transition class, but we can also write the same transition in object format as well. And when the page transition is written in object notation, the name key becomes required. And at the same time, we get a lot more freedom to customize this transition in object format. For example, by default, Vue's transition component wait for the current element to go out before the new element comes in. Hence, the default mode is always set to out in. But if you need to customize this behavior, you can always use mode property and set it to in out. Similar way, we have another key called appear. Appear help us apply transition on initial render, and by default its value is set to false, which you can always customize when you define your transition in object format. We can also make custom transitions using JavaScript hooks, and when we use transition using JavaScript hooks, we should always make sure to set our CSS to false. That way we are telling transition component to not to look into global CSS for that transition. And at this stage, we may want to reuse this custom transition on multiple pages, but not globally. And that's when we can convert it into a reusable transition object and import it on only required pages. Here, when we write transition hooks, we get element as a default argument, and this element is nothing but the root element of your Nuxt page, and we are able to select any children nodes of this root element and animate them using JavaScript animation libraries. So with that in mind, let's see how we can include GSAP in our Nuxt project. Including GSAP requires 3 steps in Nuxt. First, we will npm install GSAP. Second, and the most important step, is to transpile GSAP dependency. You can configure Nuxt to use ES modules, and for that Nuxt provides this handy option to transpile any external dependencies with Babel. So we can use it for GSAP or any other plugins of GSAP that you are using. And the third step would be to simply import GSAP and start using it. Let's see this example. We have multiple grid elements on this page, and we want to animate each one of them when the page loads, and it would look something like this. Let's see how we can create this effect using JavaScript hooks and GSAP animation library. So in this instance, we will use transition as an object. We will give it a custom name, and we will set appear to true so that we can apply this transition on initial render of the page. And we will set CSS to false because we want to use GSAP animation library. Next, we will prepare each grid items before they enter the page. So we will scale them down to half their size and set their opacity to 0. And once they enter the screen, we want to scale them back to their full size with their opacity set to 1. And we will set its ease to elastic so that they appear with playful animation. And the last and the most important option here we have is for stagger. By setting stagger to 0.2, we can make sure that all grid elements don't appear at once, but instead they appear in sequence to create a visually interesting effect. Now, this is the simplest animation you can create using green sock, but you can also use GSAP timeline to create to chain multiple animations and create really complex page transitions. Here we have one more example of page transitions where we have created a slideshow, and each slide is Nuxt page, and we can control them using the back and next button. So let's see how we can create something like this using page transition feature. So far we have seen transition value as a string and as an object, but there's a third option where we can use transition as a function. And when we use transition as a function, we receive two arguments, to and from. As you can see, both of them are route objects. When we use transition key as a function on dynamic pages, we receive dynamic parameters value for each pages, and we can use that information to render transition based on a conditional logic. And slide left and slide right that you see here are transition classes created with animate.style library. So let's quickly see how we can include animate.style in your Nuxt project. It's a two-step process. First, we npm install it, and second step would be to include this CSS in our global CSS array. And once we have that set up, we can implement them into our views transition system like so. And we can assign them to animation attributes, as we can see that slide in right, slide out left are our animate.style classes. Beyond page transitions, when we use our transition key as a function, we could access only two route objects, to and from, and sometimes that's enough. But what if your transition is more complex than that? Maybe your transition needs to react when your data or global state variables change. That's when we need to think beyond route-based transitions and revisit the original transition component that we discussed at the beginning of this talk. Let's take a look at this example. Now, this example may look like a single-page app, but it's really a full-blown website because each page has its own URL and meta tags, which is really good for the SEO. If we take a look at the component tree in our Vue.js DevTools, we can see that we have multiple components like mega menu, page navigation, and navbar, and they are all part of the default Nuxt layout. And we have 4 custom transitions which are applied to this default Nuxt layout, and they are all triggered when we change a global state variable. So let's have a look at our Vuex store, and here we can manipulate our active page index, and when we increase or decrease this index value, we can actually navigate the page. And the same can be done using this top navbar as well. And this way, with the combination of Nuxt layouts and Vuex store, we can actually build data-aware custom layouts and create a seamless user interface and maintain context of the site at the same time. And this is very much possible because of the way how layouts work in Nuxt. One more thing which is worth mentioning here is that all of these custom transition components are nothing but renderless functional components, and they actually help us bring the reactive data in the form of props to create these data-driven transitions. To summarize page transitions in Nuxt, we have learned that there are 4 ways we can create transitions, but if you are a beginner, start simple with the CSS transitions and then go advanced from thereafter. Also, page transitions are inbuilt and they come with defaults, but they can always be customized to behave differently in Nuxt. Also, the Nuxt layouts can be really powerful, and they can help us create reactive and highly interactive layouts using state variables and transitions. One last point I would like to make is that always remember that Nuxt follows a convention over configuration approach. So if you are starting out with page transition in Nuxt, start your transition journey with the default options, and you cannot go wrong when it comes to page transitions in Nuxt. Thank you.